Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ike Picone, and as one of the organizing members of the Democratic Governance Work Program of BrIAS, I am happy to announce the very first speaker in the program's lecture series, which is Professor Axel Bruns, joining us from QUT in Australia, and expert in everything digitalization and polarization. And he will enlighten us about these topics in his lecture. I wish you a very nice lecture.
All right, thank you very much. I don't know about expert in everything there, but I'll try my best. You've set the bar very high. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all so much for coming. And of course, great to be the first in this series as well, and hopefully kick it off well. This is me. I do want to acknowledge at the start also my team who've had a lot of input into this work as well, and I'll say a bit more about that as I go as well. Now, before I start properly, as we do in Australia, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which I'm lucky enough to live and work. In Brisbane, that's the Turrbal and Yagara people, the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands, and pay my respect to their elders' laws, customs, and creation spirits. I'll recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our community. Now, I'm going to bring together a few different themes here as I go through this. I'll start, as I lead into this question of polarization, with a couple of concepts that you may have seen I have had something to say about before: filter bubbles and echo chambers. I'll then talk about polarization, and then also about the practice of practice mapping, the method of practice mapping to detect the symptoms of destructive polarization. So there's a bit of conceptual work, a bit of methodological work, and then I'll try and apply that as well to a case study as I go. So that's the sort of roadmap. But I want to start actually maybe a little bit before we get to the question of polarization with the question of filter bubbles and echo chambers, because so often they are positioned as the reason that we have polarization, that even we have increasing polarization in our public debates. And of course, really what people tend to mean when they say filter bubbles, echo chambers, is that platforms and their algorithms are at fault to a very large extent for the current developments. The person on screen there is Eli Pariza, who came up with the idea of the filter bubble and published a book in 2011, I think, on that, and who really popularized that notion. Of course, echo chambers and that topic had been around a bit longer, since the start of the 2000s as well. So the problem with filter bubbles and echo chambers, I'm going to treat them together here, is really that generally in the literature they tend to be incredibly poorly defined. What do we even mean when we say echo chambers and filter bubbles? Where would we find them? Initially, particularly with filter bubbles, people talked about search engines. That's where Pariza's idea came from, that he basically quite literally said, I asked two people to Google the same thing, they got different results. Oh, look, they must be living in different filter bubbles. That's the fundamental basis of his theory of filter bubbles. And that could be, of course, then general search engines. It could be news search engines as well. It could be other forms of portals and recommender systems that basically identify the personas, the personal interests that people have, and on that basis give them different results. More recently, of course, we've talked much more about echo chambers and filter bubbles in a social media context. So where, again, possibly the algorithms of social media might place people in different echo chambers or filter bubbles based on what they assume their interests are, and thereby curate the feeds that they're seeing. It could also be, of course, that people are following different others and thereby place themselves in these spaces. But again, also with social media, there's no such thing as social media. There's many different social media platforms, and they operate in very, very different ways. So we've got to recognize that, of course. But then also on any one social media platform, you tend to have a number of very different communicative affordances. You have your own profiles and the way that you curate them. You might have topical and thematic pages or groups. You used to have hashtags on a platform called Twitter. So there's a whole number of different mechanisms by which information might be curated on these platforms. So where exactly would we locate echo chambers and filter bubbles in that context? And then really, what do we even mean by when we use these terms? Do we literally mean that people need to be hermetically sealed into these information cocoons, information bubbles, that are full of problematic information, where they no longer see anything else from the outside world, and only see that sort of in-group information that they get in these spaces? So do they need to be very strictly sealed off from the rest of the world? Do we just mean some sort of in-group that may not be totally disconnected, but tends to be self-reinforcing in its own ideological views and becomes more and more hyper-partisan? Or do we just actually mean any kind of partisan communities of any kind, so that still have lots of contact with the outside world, but have their own political views? In which case, aren't we just talking about communities of interest anyway? And is that just, so are echo chambers and filter bubbles just another way of referring to communities of interest? In which case, why do we need these terms, and are they even a problem? And then, again, I've said this a few times already, why exactly would they form? Is it because of pre-existing polarization within society on certain topics between different groups? Is it because of an algorithmic construction of these distinct publics? Based on what the algorithm assumes your interests to be, or based on how the algorithm reads your behaviors and thereby then puts you into these different spaces? Or is there some sort of feedback loop between the two, and that might be the most likely? So all of these are questions that we need to ask about these kinds of concepts. And of course, we would expect some definitions perhaps, or also then from the people who propose these terms. But that's been very much lacking. Very often, if you read Pariser, if you read Sunstein, who came up with the idea of the echo chamber, there's not actually much of a definition of what they mean by that. They just say that, oh yeah, people are in different spaces. They often, as I've said with Pariser, kind of argue from an anecdote. I asked two people to Google for the same thing, they got different results. Oh, look, there's a filter bubble. So much more of a common sense rather than a clear definition of what they mean by this. Not often very much empirical evidence beyond anecdotes either. And in fact, I have to say, neither of these are media communication scholars, are scholars of the way that people communicate on these platforms. Sunstein is a legal scholar. Pariser calls himself an activist and tech entrepreneur. So that may be the reason that there's also a lack of clear definition and a lack of empirically provable definition of these terms then out there. So that's a problem for these kinds of terms. And then, of course, if we look at actual empirical work, there are a number of studies that say that, yes, they found something they're calling an echo chamber or a filter bubble. In fact, many studies don't really distinguish between those two terms, which is also a problem. They use them interchangeably. There's literally a few I've seen where they said, we found echo chambers, aka filter bubbles. Again, why do we need both terms if they mean the same thing? If they don't mean the same thing, what do they mean, and how are they different from each other? One example of this, which is, and I'm showing these studies, I don't mean to criticize what they find, but the way that they characterize this is a really early study by Adamich and Glantz from 2005, where they looked at networks amongst bloggers. Some of you might remember this from really early days of network studies, I guess, of online phenomena. So they found that, yes, Republican bloggers are more likely to link to other Republican bloggers, and Democrat bloggers are more likely to link to other Democrat bloggers. So you get this kind of network structure where you've got these two blobs on either side of the different political groups, but in fact also quite a bit of interlinkage between them. And they then said, okay, we found a mild echo chamber. That doesn't really work if your definition of an echo chamber, though, is that they need to be hermetically sealed from each other. So really what they're finding is some level of homogeneity, of homophily on either side, but also still a lot of information traveling back and forth and contact traveling back and forth between those two sides. Is that then a problem if we're saying that echo chambers are placing us in these separate environments where we no longer see what the other side thinks or says? Well, in this case, clearly not. So can you even have a mild echo chamber and have it be a problem in that kind of case? More recent work then obviously translated this from blogs to social media. started to look particularly at Twitter because that's where we could get data, and that's really largely the reason that there's many more Twitter studies than Facebook studies. And then often looked at hashtags and keywords, hashtag and keyword-based data sets, so you gather tweets that contain these particular hashtags and keywords, and analyzed them, and often found some very mixed results. So they found that perhaps, yes, in retweet networks, there was a lot of separation between different sides of a debate. In at-mention networks, not so much, because they were all arguing at each other and with each other. In follow networks, again, perhaps the situation was different because they sometimes followed their enemies to see what the enemies thought. And of course, also some significant differences between lead users and more casual participants. The lead users might have been more active in making those distinctions between who they liked and who they didn't. Casual participants maybe didn't. So again, the picture is not very clear about the existence of echo chambers and filter bubbles overall in this. And then there's still the question of what we even define as an echo chamber or filter bubble in that kind of context. So what I'm trying to say here in short is that the empirical evidence does not really support anything that we could call an echo chamber or filter bubble that is distinctive enough to cause the problems that the people who've identified these concepts say they are causing. I'll go through that in a little bit more detail because that's probably a fairly confusing way of saying it. The kind of hard echo chambers and filter bubbles, the kinds of hermetically sealed environments that people have talked about, where you no longer see alternative views, you no longer see things that disagree with you, there's very, very little to no evidence that these even exist. In fact, the very success of mis- and disinformation campaigns that we've seen plenty of and that we've empirically proven to exist over the last 10 years or so, many, many times, actually depends, if you think about it, on the absence of echo chambers and filter bubbles. If you had a mis- or disinformation campaign on a certain topic, and that information was just pinging around within an echo chamber of people who are already convinced that vaccines don't work, let's say, then, for instance, that wouldn't really cause that much trouble because it would just reach people who are already anti-vaxxers. The problem with these campaigns is that they do reach into the general public, that they do reach out much further, and that's where they're causing harm. So in that sense, these kinds of campaigns very much depend on the fact that information breaks out of these echo chambers or filter bubbles that are purported to exist, or out of communities that are already convinced of the information that they're spreading. Further, we see that the hyper-partisans who are most actively supporting these sorts of campaigns, or really particular ideologies and worldviews, are frequently very actively seeking out their enemies, seeking out the people that disagree with them, partly to troll them, quite frankly, partly to argue with them, partly to also inform themselves about what the other side thinks so they can find arguments against that. And there's plenty of evidence that, yeah, the most ideologically one-sided users are also the ones that pay most attention to their opponents, to their enemies. So again, that goes against the idea of an echo chamber filter bubble, that you're sticking just with your own people, with your own side. And of course, a lot of what I'm saying here is about social media, but we know that people's media uses continue to be mixed, that they are maybe not reading newspapers anymore, but certainly still watching TV, listening to the radio, encountering information in other ways more broadly, and not just spending time on social media or even just within the one social media space. So they're still encountering quite a broad mix, and in fact, the heavier social media users, and there's evidence on that as well, are also the ones that encounter the most diverse mix of media. So the more active you are on social media, the more likely you are, in fact, are also to see cross-attitudinal information. And then the flip side of that is the people who really don't care about the news and about politics are actually in the majority. We here in this room, I'm assuming, are kind of an exception from the broader public who really don't care that much about news and politics. But that also then means that they're very unlikely to lock themselves into some sort of ideological bubble because they simply don't care enough to do it. So that again speaks against this. So put all of that together and we get to the point where this idea of mild echo chambers and filter bubbles is an oxymoron. It just means that, okay, yes, you're slightly tending towards one side or another of an argument, but that can't in itself, because it's so mild, cause any problem with the information that you're interacting with, because you're just not locking yourself away from everything else. And that's really just some mild selective attachment to a particular side of information. But that's, again, not the problem that Sunstein and Pariser and others are writing about. And we already have perfectly good terms. We don't need echo chambers and filter bubbles to talk about this. We can talk about communities of interest. We can talk about counter-publics. We can talk, in some cases, about what has been called parasitic publics that attach themselves to more mainstream communities to try and convert them to their side. These can be problematic in their own right. I'm not trying to underplay that, but at the same time, that's something quite different from echo chambers in the way that they've been defined by the Sunsteins and Parisers of this world. And ultimately, the question is not so much what are they doing, what are the underlying issues for these groups to exist. And these underlying issues tend to be societal, tend to be based at the individual or the group level. They're not in themselves technological problems. There are, and that's also, I don't want to let the platforms come off scot-free here, there are plenty of problems with social media platforms, but these are not the problems that we're looking for. So it's not that the platforms are putting us in echo chambers or filter bubbles. The platforms are doing a lot of other things very poorly, for instance, to deal with hate speech and other forms of problematic information. And that's what we should focus on when we deal with platforms, not the idea that they put people into echo chambers or filter bubbles. So to put all of that together, this is a graph I keep coming back to from a study by Williams et al. On online communities debating climate change. They've looked at 4 different hashtags: climate change, global warming, anthropogenic global warming, AGW. They've looked at follower and retweet and mention networks. What you're seeing there is that the patterns are very, very diverse between folks in green who accept the scientific consensus and folks in red who deny the scientific consensus. So on the follower networks, yes, there tends to be some separation in who you follow, whether, and these are the lead users in these communities. So people who end up denying the scientific consensus tend to follow others who deny the scientific consensus. In retweets, similar sort of story as well. If you're on one side of the debate, then you tend to amplify the messages from others who are on your side. And then in mention networks, it's the entirely opposite pattern where they argue with each other, they engage with each other, not necessarily in a very positive way, but they do engage, and in doing so, obviously see what the other side thinks and says as well. So what they're saying, and this is kind of typical for many of these studies, they said, okay, we found both open forums and echo chambers in the same hashtags. Doesn't really work that way. Because you can't be both in an open forum and an echo chamber at the same time. And certainly not, you can't be in an echo chamber in your retweeting and be in an open forum in your mentioning. That doesn't make sense because it cannot have the results that the proponents of echo chamber and filter bubble concepts say it has, because you will still encounter the other side's view, basically. So that's as a brief introduction, the question of echo chambers and filter bubbles. What we do see here clearly is a level of polarization between these different views. And that, to me, is actually the more important aspect that we need to confront in all of this. So the overall problem, I would posit, is not actually a problem of people being hermetically sealed into these kinds of bubbles, but quite the opposite. The problem is actually connectivity, not disconnection. Not the fact that people are sealed from each other, but the fact that people are connected to so much information that they're often very much overwhelmed with that. And on that, I want to say a little bit more here about connectivity. I'm not in itself critiquing the question of connectivity. Connection via social media or via other communicative tools is incredibly important. It provides community support, it provides social connection, all of that. But it also enables people to see a lot of information and be overwhelmed by a lot of information that they don't have the capacity, the information literacy, the digital literacy to process. And I've got this image here on screen, which is from an anti-COVID lockdown protest in Melbourne in 2020. And that's an example of what happens with information overload. If you read through this, and I don't advise reading through this too closely, but you're seeing a whole bunch of things coming together. You've got the QAnon slogan, where we go one, we go all at the top. You've got QAnon itself appearing, pandemic, Epstein Island, Clinton emails, the Great Awakening, ritual child sacrifice, geoengineering, the Illuminati, of course, adrenochrome, Tesla free energy, 5G, PSYOPs, vaccines, and so on. So this is not someone who is in an echo chamber. This is not someone who's disconnected from the world. This is someone who's too connected to everything, has seen a lot of stuff from all over the place, and has very, in a very, what's the word I'm looking for, creative way, combined all of that into a poster, but also into a worldview. If you look at the images, Bill Gates is actually on there somewhere as well. There's a bunch of other stuff showing up too. So this is someone who's in the moment of the pandemic and the overwhelm of the pandemic, looking for answers, looking for maybe a way out of all of this, looking for reasons, and has put all of that together, basically, has created their own worldview from that. And that's what I mean. This is not someone, again, who's in an echo chamber where they're only seeing a very limited slice of information. This is someone who sees too much and doesn't know how to deal with that. And that takes me back to this quote from David Weinberger from 2004. So way before, really at the start of this idea of echo chambers, who says the problem with an extraterrestrial conspiracy mailing list is not that it's an echo chamber, it's that it thinks that there's a conspiracy by extraterrestrials. That goes for anti-vaxxers, that goes for many of the other so-called echo chambers that we keep talking about. It's not the problem that people are kind of hermetically sealed off for information, it's that through some mechanism, for some reason, they have adopted a position, a worldview on what's going on in the world that is very, very much outside the realm of realism, of possibilities, of empirical evidence. And that's the problem that, yes, does need to be addressed, but it's not going to be addressed by trying to rescue people from echo chambers or filter bubbles. So that's the kind of the opening spiel here I'm going to make just on echo chambers and filter bubbles. If you want more, I've got a book to sell you. But the short version of that, in case any of you read German, this I found a wonderful article that says all of that in very brief. That basically says this is why the filter bubble is the dumbest metaphor on the internet, and I tend to agree. So it's a wonderful brief piece that kind of says all of that. There is, I think, gradually now a kind of shift away from these ideas, which are ultimately incredibly techno-determinist ideas that blame communication technology for problems that are actually much more human and societal problems. And gradually we're starting to see that this is being picked up also by media that have previously tended to blame technology more than actually deal with the underlying causes for all of this. And as this says there somewhere at the bottom, contrary to soap bubbles, the filter bubble myth is continuing to hang on quite stubbornly, but we need to actually move on beyond that. And that's the reason I'm saying all of that is because, again, the underlying problem that I see here is not some sort of technologically driven existence of these information enclaves where people have different views and no longer see each other's views. They do see each other's views and they see them quite frequently, but that is not stopping them from being deeply polarized. And that's the central kind of concept I want to speak much more to here. This, by the way, and there'll be a few images like that, this is what you get when you ask Midjourney for an image of polarization, which I find quite interesting, just as a side note, because it's so very American as well. You're seeing there two pale, stale males facing up against each other. You see them in blue and red, so Republican and Democrat. Democrat and Republican, actually, in their weird color scheme that they have. And of course, they're diametrically opposed to each other in a very bipolar kind of form of polarization, squaring off against each other. So that's how many people understand polarization. And that's actually a bit problematic as well, because polarization is a lot of other things as well, not just this kind of image. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about that. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say here is built on work that I'm doing with my team. We're lucky enough to have a 5-year project, which is in our system called an Australian Laureate Fellowship, on the drivers and dynamics of partisanship and polarization in online public debate at the DMRC, and there's a larger team involved there, as you can see. We're very much interested in conducting cross-national, case study-based and longitudinal analysis, which is also very much building on developing additional methods for studying polarization. So what I want to start with is actually this question of what do we mean by polarization in the first place? The more you do look into literature on polarization, the more you see that people can't actually agree on what it means. And that much of the literature on polarization tends to be very much dominated by American understandings of polarization, which don't work in Australia, don't work here, don't work in most other countries which have a slightly more sophisticated political system than the Americans do. But this is kind of what you're getting in the first place in most cases. You get this sort of Democrat versus Republican understanding of polarization, which yes, and clearly, and this is only going to 2017, and God only knows what it would look like now, where you're seeing that the median position on a bunch of political values and issues in the US has gradually drifted further and further apart in the surveys that have been done on this, and that the two camps in American politics are more and more split across each other. I would maybe say here too that the Republican position itself might also be on the verge of splitting there into what might have been at that point more of a Tea Party or maybe early MAGA movement and more establishment Republicans. You see the spread there of Republican positions broadening out as well. That's not the only story in the US though, because there's also, and sorry, maybe I should go to this first, the partisan assessment of presidents over time has split much, much more. So whenever there's a Democrat president, Democrats think that president is great, and Republicans think they're terrible, and vice versa, of course, as well. So this is what this graph shows, that, yeah, the rating of presidents has predictably perhaps widened as well. The gap has widened between Republicans and Democrats over time. Having said that, and that's from the same, I think, Pew Research Center study, they also find that, in fact, quite a few Americans these days also think that none of the political options that they've got, the two political options that they've got, are any good. And what by that point, 2023, about a third of Americans had an unfavorable view of both sides of politics. That's actually starting to show us that the kind of bipolar understanding of polarization in the US doesn't necessarily hold anymore either, because there's also a lot of just hateful politics overall, perhaps, going on there. Now, that all leads us to really ask, well, what do we even mean by polarization? Do we just mean whether they like Republicans or Democrats, in which case that doesn't translate anywhere else? Probably not. We've got to think a bit more systematically about different forms and different types of polarization. We've gone through this in this article that I'm going to refer to in a moment as well, to actually understand in the literature what have people talked about. And that starts at different levels. So there's, of course, polarization at the level of individual issues, whether you're for or against a particular issue or what views you have. So that might be a disagreement on specific policy settings. The graph I showed you of Republicans and Democrats drifting apart is in part based on asking them, how do you feel about abortion? How do you feel about immigration? How do you feel about whatever other trigger issues there are in the US? And then seeing how those issue views then aligned at a higher level. So that's issue-based polarization. Again, that sort of aggregates up potentially into ideological polarization, where it's no longer about your view on particular issues, but your view on overall ideologies, and how you feel on a particular issue might be affected by your overall ideology. That's called partisan sorting, that basically if you're a Republican or a Democrat, gradually you will adopt whatever the view of your side of politics is on that issue. You can't, it's harder for you to be, let's say, a Republican that supports it's harder for you to be a Republican who supports women's reproductive rights, for instance, because so much of the Republican Party has a very staunch, conservative, pro-life view of things. So that's the kind of partisan sorting that I'm talking about. That's the ideological side of polarization, the ideological level of polarization. Increasingly, then, that might also turn into affective polarization, where it's no longer actually about your rational understanding of what your ideology is, but actually just your affective alignment or affective attachment to one side or the other of politics. Again, I'm using American examples here for the moment, so how strongly you feel about being a Republican or Democrat and what that says about you as a person, and how much you hate the other side, frankly, as well in that case. So that's more of an in-group, out-group kind of attachment, essentially, that's felt emotionally rather than necessarily understood from a rational ideological point of view. That then also affects other forms of polarization that are slightly different. So that affects perceived polarization, your perception of your own side and the other side and how far they're apart. And there's plenty of studies that have shown that people think the other side of politics is much further away from them than they actually are when you ask them about certain issues. So that's perceived polarization at the individual level, but also it might also be based on how that's then reported, and how reporters, of course, themselves, who are also subject to perceived polarization, might also then report about the differences between different sides of politics. That, in turn, might also affect interpretive polarization. So when you see news reports, even neutral news reports about a certain issue, how you read them based on your own understanding of your own side and the other side might be totally different from how someone from the other side might read that same article and might understand those same facts. So a report saying the unemployment rate is at this level could be seen as, okay, that's great because it means it's pretty low, or it could be read as that's really bad because it means it's rising. So that's how different partisans might interpret the same facts, the same issues, the same events, the same media coverage in very, very different ways as well. And that then also might affect interactional polarizations, who you choose to interact with, and not just who, but also maybe what information, what sources, what other aspects you might choose to interact with, of course. And that then is the final sort of level of, how you engage with others, how and whether you engage with others, in fact. That might be based on your understanding of who these people are and how you expect them to react to the things that you might have to say to them as well. So these are all different forms of polarization that have been identified in the literature. And there are many more, frankly, as well. There is in the polarization literature this sort of tendency to attach more and more adjectives to the word polarization, to find other forms of polarization. And that makes this quite complex and often, frankly, quite confusing for people to work with. Plus, then there's the fact that many studies that seek out to find evidence of polarization don't tend to identify which type of polarization they're actually talking about. So in the end, they might just say, we found evidence of polarization, as I've, in a sense, said with the Williams et al. Graph of the 9 networks. Yes, there's polarization, but what kind of polarization is it? In the first place, presumably interactional polarization, because they've chosen to interact in different ways or not with people on the other side of this issue. It's probably also issue-based. It may also be ideological. It quite possibly is affective as well. And we could look at the tweets that were involved in those interactions to see to what extent there's rational debate or very emotional screaming at each other going on. So, which types of polarization do we see in these kinds of networks? That also needs to be clearly identified, perhaps. But even if we can get some clarity on what forms of polarization we're talking about, we still then also have the problem or the question of, well, is it actually a problem? Is it a problem that people are polarized? Is it a problem that people have different views on the same issue? Well, actually, probably not so much necessarily. So what we do, and I'm sorry, this is adding another adjective, in this article that I've referred to, and that's the article there led by one of my colleagues, Katharina Esau, what we do is to distinguish between, if you like, ordinary and maybe not even so problematic polarization and what we call destructive polarization. So a higher level, a greater degree of polarization that becomes problematic for a particular debate or even for society overall. So the question essentially with all of this is, how bad is it? If we're seeing that people are polarized against each other on particular issues or ideologies and all the other things, is that a problem? In the first place, of course, we need to acknowledge that all politics is polarized. We wouldn't have politics without some level of disagreement between different positions, whether that's on an issue or even on an ideology. All politics is polarized. If we didn't have any polarization, we would have a one-party state. We would just have one side of politics. We'd have no side of politics because there wouldn't be any. That's not a good thing either. So the end goal can't be to eradicate polarization altogether and just have total constant consensus on everything. That's stagnation, ultimately. So all politics is polarized, just not to the point of dysfunction all the time. Also, and this is where, again, the very American view of much of the polarization literature is problematic, much politics, maybe most politics in functioning countries, is multipolar and not just left versus right or Republican versus Democrat. I know that's the case here, I know that's the case in Australia, I know that's the case in most other multi-party systems. Well, you have multiple parties. You don't just have a left and the right, but you've got actually multiple different views that are maybe battling out these issues in Parliament and sometimes in outside of Parliament as well, but also that have the need to form coalitions, to govern together and to find compromise and consensus, at least for the time being, on certain issues in order to be able to work together and, be in power, if nothing else. So in most countries, politics is not a winner-takes-all situation, but multipolar with alignments between these different groups that are temporary but sometimes very stable as well. So we've got to get away from this just polarization is two sides on a single scale that are in some way opposed to each other. It's much more around discourse alliances, political alliances, and antagonisms as well. So if we have these kinds of antagonisms between different camps in politics, then when does that actually become problematic? When does a mild antagonism and a justified disagreement on a certain issue turn into what we call destructive polarization? Well, we suggest that there are 5 key symptoms that we might want to look for there. We're not saying these are all the symptoms. There may well be others that we haven't thought of, but we think that these cover quite a few of the cases pretty well. The first is that there's a breakdown of communication, that people are failing to communicate effectively anymore, that they maybe are just starting to shout at each other or talk past each other. So breakdown of communication doesn't mean that they don't communicate at all anymore. It might be that they're not communicating effectively and in a respectful way with each other anymore. If they're just shouting at each other, that's a breakdown of communication just as much as if they just don't talk to each other anymore. Another aspect of this is discrediting and dismissing of information, where they're actually already dismissing information just because it comes from the other side of politics. I'm sure you can all think of examples, but particularly, for instance, the dismissing of statistics that they don't like, the firing, as we've seen in the US again, of the various government department folks who provide, let's say, labor statistics that the president doesn't like. That's a form of discrediting and dismissing of information as well. An erasure of complexities, which means that really complex topics, like, for instance, under what circumstances and up to what point should abortion be legal and should abortion be allowable, that just becomes pro-life versus pro-choice, and that there's no exceptions to rules being made at all anymore. Exacerbated attention and space for extreme voices, so that the louder and more extreme voices get equal space within political debate and within political coverage, by the way, news coverage as well. So that essentially the Overton window, as it's called, keeps broadening to include more and more extreme voices in all of this as well. And as part of that, and sort of maybe very much related to that, exclusion through emotions as well, where it's the emotional voices that often carry the day, that say, well, if you're supporting this, then you must be evil and we cannot really debate with you anymore. That's also deeply problematic. So these are the 5 symptoms that we see as particularly critical here. They don't all need to be present for polarization to be destructive, but they often occur together. Again, how strongly they're all present may vary from case to case, of course, but if you see one or more of these, then there's a good chance that at least we're drifting towards destructive polarization. And I should also say it's not just about, okay, they're there or they're not, so it's a binary choice. Is polarization destructive or not? But it's a matter of degrees as well, how destructive we might assess a particular debate to be in terms of its polarization. Now, the next question then becomes, how do we assess that? How do we identify these? And here I want to spend a little bit of time on this idea of practice mapping, which we've developed, which is, again, a different article there if you want to have a closer look down the track as well. That works particularly well for the analysis of social media debate and of news coverage as well. Where we're interested in the practices that people actually engage in as they engage in polarized debates. So by practice here, in a social media context, we mean, as it says, that the sum total of everything that the accounts involved in the debate are doing, their actions and interactions, the way that they engage with others, but also what they themselves are saying. So it's the doings and sayings of these accounts, as practices are often described. And of course, for them to be practices, they need to be more than just one-off. They need to be repeated to a certain extent as well. That's what we're interested in here with practice mapping. Practice mapping can help us identify the different distinct groups involved in the debate and the different distinct practices that characterize these groups. And then that enables us to see, well, these practices that they engage in, do they show any of the signs of destructive polarization within this debate? Now, in part, this is driven by the fact also that the sort of Twitter analysis that I showed you with that graph of the 9 network graphs is actually no longer very easily possible. We're also at a point where we need to move beyond Twitter analysis in our social media work because, frankly, Twitter is no longer there. It's turned into something horrible called X. And data access to what happens on Twitter is no longer available either. So also we need to understand how debates happen on many other. We've always needed to understand how debates happen on many other platforms, but that need has been sharpened even further by the developments now. So what we're interested in here is social network analysis, but also well beyond the kind of very rich data that Twitter used to provide, beyond that sort of golden age of network data that we might have experienced for the last 10 years or so. We don't actually, for many other platforms, even have much networked interaction data in the first place. You can't get a lot of interaction data out of Facebook or Instagram. You don't really have networks of interaction on thread-based platforms like Reddit and YouTube and TikTok and so on. So how do we even deal with these sorts of platforms if we're wanting to do the sort of analysis that we're interested in? So what we're interested in finding is essentially communities of practice, quite literally, groups of users, groups of participants, groups of accounts that engage in similar practices in a sustained kind of way. And that means we need to pay attention to their content as much as to their interactions. Networks are often very useful for that. So network analysis is one of the key tools that we're using here. But we need to also use activities, incorporate activities that aren't simply interactions between accounts, but are also actions that they take just as they're speaking, as they're posting their content. Communities can be defined not just by how they interact with each other and with others, but also whether they have shared languages, shared identities, shared beliefs, shared values, shared ideas, shared sources, and so on. How do we identify those in the data that we've got? That's the challenge here in practice mapping. And again, part of this is driven by the end of an era with Twitter having very much disappeared from the scene as a meaningful platform, and in doing so also the lack of network data that we've got. In fact, sorry, maybe that image needs a trigger warning, I'm not sure, sorry about that. But particularly with Facebook data, whether that was from CrowdTangle, which was the old way of accessing Facebook data, or now through the Meta Content Library, even more so, we simply don't have much interaction data, as I said, for these platforms. What we do have is data on how people post on public spaces on these. So we can look at things like how they're sharing, what links they're sharing, to what domains, to what specific URLs, how they're on-sharing maybe posts from other pages and groups, how they're sharing specific types of content, for instance, YouTube videos, and just the overall language that they're using, the terms and terminology, the ways of expressing themselves that they're using. That could be word embeddings, for instance, in the posts themselves. So these are the sorts of practices that we're interested in, and we're then interested in mapping essentially similarities between individual participants in these and across these practices to identify clusters of accounts that share the same practices. That's what practice mapping does. And that then gives us a network of similarities in practices, no longer just of interactions, but similarities in practices across these different groups of accounts. Now, we've outlined that in this article in Social Media and Society, which tries to go beyond this idea of interaction mapping, which often is quite limited, and towards practice mapping. So, and maybe I'm sort of slightly repeating myself here, but what we are interested in operationalizing as we're looking at these similarities in practice are, yes, still interactions between accounts. That's still important, but it's not the only thing. The kind of content that accounts post, so whether that's in terms of their topics, the sentiment, the hashtags, named entities, whatever else you can think of that you might extract from their posts. The use of sources, so URLs, domains, embedded content, and so on. Possibly some other attributes that we might have about these accounts that might come out of their profile information, for instance, or anything else that we might manually or computationally code about these accounts as well. So, for instance, if they are institutional accounts of politicians, of other societal actors, we might identify them by the type of account that they are as well. And of course, whatever else we might think of. And I'm talking here mainly about social media, but this can be translated to other forms of content as well quite successfully. What we then do as we have this kind of information, as we extract that information for each post and then and aggregated by the accounts that have posted these posts, is we turn all of that, and this is sort of getting a little bit more technical, but I'll just say this briefly, and the article provides more information. We turn this into vectors. So first we have the post ID, the account ID, and the type of activity that they engage in. So that might be that in this post, this account shared a link to that source, or in this post, this account used a term like pro-life or pro-choice, and that distinguishes what they're talking about. We then turn that into vectors, so we have an activity vector that describes the sum total of all the activities that an account engaged in our data set. And then we engage in a pairwise comparison of these activity vectors for each pair of accounts, so we can calculate the similarity in activities for each pair of accounts, and then use that to graph this as a network. That's the overall logic. Again, happy to talk more about this maybe in questions, but that's the overall logic and the overall approach that we take with practice mapping. So we're creating a map that is ultimately about the similarities in activities between the accounts in our data set, no longer just who they're interacting with and how they're interacting with them. And very briefly, I'm just going to show you what that looks like for an actual case study. In Australia, we have unfortunately had a very important case study for this, where the government ran a referendum on greater recognition of indigenous peoples in Australia in the Constitution. And that led to a campaign, obviously, from different sides. As you see, this is a clear example of polarization, if nothing else, the yes versus the no campaign. And of course, a referendum necessarily simplifies things to a simple yes versus no. But we looked at how that campaign unfolded on Facebook and what that then looked like. So without wanting to go into full detail here about the backgrounds to this, obviously, Australia is a colonial country where lands were taken away from the indigenous owners. That's been a very complex topic in the country since the Europeans first took land in 1788, and has led also to a consistent and persistent disadvantagement of Indigenous Australians. This was meant to be addressed by this idea of a voice to Parliament, where Indigenous Australians would have a standing representation to Parliament to present their views and their ideas on current legislation, which was first demanded in something called the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, was endorsed by the incoming Prime Minister Anthony Albanese when he won the 2022 election. And then in 2023, in October, there was a constitutional referendum on this proposal for a voice to Parliament, an Indigenous voice to Parliament. That's what that looked like without wanting to go into detail, but essentially a constitutional change requires a referendum on that issue, and this was what was asked. Now, Australia, like I think Belgium, has compulsory voting. Is that still the case here? Yep, good. So obviously turnout was high, and referenda have a fairly high level of, a fairly significant level of success that they need to reach in order to be accepted. That was not the case with this, even though historically, and this is sort of graphing from August 22 all the way through the referendum day, initially support for greater Indigenous recognition and representation was very high according to opinion polls, but that completely reversed by the time that we got to the referendum itself, from, as it says there, 65, 66 to 34, all the way to a 40-60 split of the national vote on the referendum in the end. So the referendum failed, and we would suggest that that's in part because of the destructive polarization of the campaign that we saw. So give you a quick example of what some of that looked like, and to go through some of the symptoms of dysfunction and symptoms of destructive polarization that we saw. This is a clear example of erasure of complexities. If you don't know, vote no. You can't simplify this anymore. This was obviously from the No campaign run. This is an Instagram post by the Liberal Party that supported the No campaign, and it basically just appeals to ignorance. If you don't know, inform yourselves. No. If you don't know, vote no. So that's erasure of complexities. If you don't know what this whole thing is about, then just vote no. That's, I think, a clear example of that. Now, what we did in analyzing the Voice to Parliament campaign then was to gather data from Facebook, and you can only gather public data from Facebook, so public pages, public groups, from the start of the year to the day before the referendum itself. So we gathered the posts on public pages and groups that referred to the referendum in one form or another, and the attributes in the practice mapping that we incorporated were what domains they were sharing, what YouTube videos they're sharing, what posts were being on-shared from other groups and pages, and what language choices they made. So these are the four practice attributes that we looked at. When we did the practice mapping then, so when we looked at the similarities between pages and groups in these practices, this is the graph that we got. This is what that looked like. And we then did a close reading of what these different clusters of groups and pages are. And it became very clear that we've got a fairly clear distinction between a yes side and a no side of the debate. And looking further at who's involved there, we saw that there's a clear cluster associated with no campaigners, and one of the far-right news outlets, Sky News Australia, is very strong, particularly in that cluster. We've got a separate but closely aligned cluster of the One Nation political party, which is a far-right party in Australia that again supported the No campaign, but worked in a slightly different way. And then we've got a bunch of clusters on the other side that are related to the Yes campaign. The official Yes 23 campaign and campaign page and its supporters, local grassroots campaigns across the country, community organizations that in one form or another supported a yes vote, a bunch of pages and groups that weren't so much, that were for a yes vote, but weren't so much for a yes vote because they supported Indigenous rights, but simply because they opposed the conservative forces that opposed the yes vote. So they're simply there because they are Labour, they are Unionists, they are others that are progressive groups and oppose the right-wing and far-right groups that are against constitutional recognition. And then we had some clusters that were really more about information sharing. So this is ABC, our national public broadcaster, and other pages that shared its content. And this is the other public broadcaster, SBS, which also caters particularly to indigenous audiences with its NITV channel, and that sits quite separately from the rest again. So what we're seeing overall here is there is a clear group of antagonists, of people opposing the referendum, and more of an agonistic discursive alliance, so different groups that for various different reasons are for a yes vote, but were not necessarily coordinating their activities, provided very different arguments, shared very different content, were in very different ways for yes, and never really quite coalesced into a strong yes movement in the way that the no movement certainly did. So that's the result of the practice mapping here. We also then looked at the polls in a bit more detail. The first thing that we did was just to run a very simple zero-shot classifier over this that asked for the different rhetorical attributes of posts, and that's what that looks like. Without wanting to go through this in more detail, essentially asks, is this post polarizing? Is this post divisive? Is this post confrontational, misleading, patronizing, and so on? And again, you see a very clear distinction here. The One Nation and No Campaigner clusters are highly polarizing, highly divisive, highly confrontational, misleading, patronizing, dismissive, extreme, inflammatory, unsubstantiated, and often quite emotional, although emotional kind of cuts across all of them. And on the other side, the yes campaigners tend to be very strongly empathetic and very low on these other attributes, basically. So that, in some ways, just validates the practice mapping that we've done, because these clusters that we've identified, these different groups we've identified, operate in very different ways in their posting styles. The other thing that we could then also do is look at activity over time to see how these different groups were very, very differently active. The no campaigners got started much, much earlier and posted much, much more than other groups did. That's the red line there, and you see that they, from June or so onwards, from mid-year or so onwards, were far more active in their daily posting activities than anyone else was, and that on the yes side, it really was largely the anti-LNP, so the groups that were just against conservatives. They became active a little bit later on, from sort of July, August onwards, but didn't necessarily, have the same sort of engagement and impact as the no campaigners had already had for quite a long time before that. And also in terms of engagement, the no campaigners and the One Nation group, that's the red and the orange lines in the second graph, got a lot more engagement by audiences than anyone else did, really from very early on. So they were very, very active and very, very successful in pushing their point much earlier and much more strongly, and that's seen in their engagement metrics as well. So what I'm trying to say with this is not so much that we've kind of done a full analysis of all of that yet, that's still to come, but we're seeing some very, very clear differences between these different practice clusters that we've identified in our network. And what we're interested in now as we go forward in this is, does it show distinct practices? Yes, clearly. We're seeing some very distinct groups there with their own specific practices. We're seeing some obvious divergences from this early analysis already in how they act and what kind of language they're using and how they engage with the issue at hand. We would suggest that they're already also that they can already also be described as communities of practice, that they have again distinct practices that unify them and unify their activities, and that particularly on the no side there really is, if you like, an overarching community of practice that combines everyone who was on the no side, whereas on the yes side we see these individual smaller communities of practice, but there wasn't an overall yes campaigning practice, and that may well have been the downfall, certainly as far as Facebook is concerned, of the yes campaign overall, but of course Facebook is only one aspect of that. And that we're seeing also some fairly significant and severe differences in these practices. So it's not just a mild difference there, but clearly very different practices that we see. And of course, over time, that also looks quite different already across these different groups. Now, the bigger question then is, of course, and that's not something that the practice mapping itself answers, but it provides us a way of identifying these communities that we can then interrogate in more detail. Should we now interpret that as showing the symptoms of destructive polarization? Again, in some aspects, yes, I would already answer that question with a yes, but for us now, the next step is to look in more detail at whether all of these symptoms are in fact present. So I've said a little bit here about maybe a breakdown of communication. I've certainly said a bit more about the exclusion through emotions as well. I think both of those we can already start to see from the analysis that we've done, but we're now also, for instance, interested in the space given to extreme voices in what's being said here. That needs a bit further analysis of the specific communication practices of the different groups that we've identified. So for us, the next step is now to work through these symptoms and test whether these are maybe not all present, but which of them are present for the different groups that we've been looking at, that we've identified through the practice mapping itself. One thing that might also emerge from that is, of course, that polarization in this case and in the other cases that we apply this to is asymmetrical. And that's also quite important to note, that one side of a debate, or any one side of a debate, might be a lot more extreme and destructively polarized than the other side of a debate is. That, for instance, those often very far-right actors opposing indigenous recognition might have been a lot more destructive in their attempts to polarize this issue than the more mainstream actors on the yes side of the debate. So we should not normally expect kind of a balance there in the symptoms. We should not normally expect that what one side does is mirrored by what the other side of a debate or the other sides of a debate are doing. That's really important to keep in mind with all of that as well. So that gives you a bit of an idea of where we're at, from moving through the conceptual work on polarization, through the methodological development of practice mapping, to the empirical application of that to a case in terms of then detecting the symptoms of destructive polarization. I might leave it there, and hopefully there's a bit of time for questions still as well. So thank you.
Test 1, 2. Are there questions? Oops.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much for the lecture. I found it fascinating and it's very thought-provoking. I'm interested mainly on the statement, because I think you make a very good case in, and I was very convinced, I've been already convinced in the past reading your work, about why filter bubbles and echo chambers, at least in a hard sense, they don't exist. My question is, and I would like to hear your thoughts, do you find this is the same for every social media platform? So what I was thinking while listening to the lecture, and I think this is a point that you touch upon at the end, is that the criticism from the concept stems from seeing the empirical evidence that we have found in the past, studying Twitter interactions, Facebook interactions, etc. And I think you are right that they show that when you have a social media platform that is based on social networking, people at the end find ways to interact with the opposite side, interact with different peoples, etc. And the empirical evidence that we have is a bit shaky. But in my research, I'm focusing mainly on TikTok, and I'm interested in the TikTok case and the YouTube case, because I think you also said, and it's a very interesting point, that only looking at the interactions, we don't have the full picture. And we know in TikTok and on YouTube, for example, many people are what we colloquially call lurkers, in the sense that they are basically consuming videos. I think the fact that these platforms are highly based on algorithmic content recommendation is mediating content consumption in a way that maybe is totally different from Twitter and the others. And even in the example that you show at the end, maybe this type of content consumption is not reflected on empirical data that we are collecting about sharing videos in communities, whatever, because that is still requires an active action of networking that maybe we are not capturing all this individual content consumption. And I know now many people, including myself, they are working with data donations to try to like check how this is happening. So basically my question for you would be like, now that you are entering this methodological terrain of like practice mapping and getting deeper into the topic, do you think you might find out that echo chambers and filter bubbles are actually a real thing, maybe defined in a different way in this type of platforms? Or what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, and you're right. There's always going to be on almost any social media platform, there's always going to be that category of users who don't really leave traces as such, certainly that we can observe. Obviously the platforms might be able to observe them, but that do not actually communicate actively on a platform, just lurk, just follow, just consume, and their actions we cannot observe that way. So you're right. Data donations are really, really important, and Ike and I talked a bit about before this talk as well about some of the methods for data donation that people are using to really understand, well, what do ordinary users who are not very active at posting, what do they actually see and encounter, and what does the platform serve them ultimately? So I think for one, the question's still not answered there because we're already starting to gather, we're only starting to gather really more comprehensive data sets on what people are doing on those platforms, what we can see, and more needs to be done basically to understand what platforms are serving. That might also, of course, as you're saying, it certainly is very different from platform to platform, depending on how their algorithms are designed. One thing I would say, though, is that those lurkers, those users, if they're really ordinary users who don't have particular high levels of activity, there may not be a great deal of politically focused use there either. So they may end up getting a stream of information that is somehow suited to what the platform thinks their personal interests are, but without a great deal of activity on those platforms, the platform might have a hard time really reading that out as well, out of just your consumptive choices. So the platform might serve you more of what you've already consumed, but whether or not that's problematic in a sort of echo chamber filter bubble sense, if you're purely conserving funny, cat videos or something, yes, you get more funny cat videos, but that may not in itself be a problem as such. Those users who are more politically active would possibly also be more likely to be actively posting. I would suggest, and in that sense, that may not be such an issue. The other question is still whether those users are purely active on that platform or also across many other platforms where they're still seeing a broader range of other content.
May I add something? Sorry, I don't want to monopolize. Yeah, I agree in that sense, but I also think you made a very valid point that we are like a specific group or part of the population that we are highly interested on this. Yep. I would say that even if people are not commenting or sharing on TikTok, that doesn't mean they are not actively consuming. People watch through thousands of videos and sometimes they get political content that they are not actively communicating. Yep. So I think we will find out.
Exactly. But in essence, we would expect them then to have to very actively select and engage with that content in order for the platform to serve them much more of that as well. Because if they just see the odd political video every once in a while and don't really do anything with that, the platform would still not have the signal that it should serve them more of that, I guess. But again, I think the jury is very much out on that. You're absolutely right on that,
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Right, from my part as well, thank you very much for this interesting lecture. As a researcher on online disinformation, I was really relieved and happy to see that you took a stance against the techno-deterministic nature of the status quo in analyzing these problems. However, in that specific regard, I must say that I was also kind of a little bit disappointed, really, when I saw the slide with I think it was the woman with the QAnon slogan and all of that stuff, where you kind of stated that through fake news, there was like a tendency for hyper-partisanism and then finding communities for supporting these views. in my understanding, to move away from techno-determinism and looking at much more, let's say, contextually, I thought like this didn't really make sense in that regard for me. Because if we want to get away from this techno-deterministic nature of the status quo, shouldn't we look at like in the opposite way, that people are experiencing discontent because of things that happened in the real world, like financial crises and so forth. And then in looking for support in these views, find communities where fake news or alternative narratives might be spread around. So that's my question really, is in what way is your work moving away from this techno-deterministic view? Because I saw it a little bit as just a difference techno-determinism.
Okay, sorry, I might have not been clear enough on that then, because that's precisely my point of view. That, and COVID is a great example for that, because it is a crisis moment, a moment of, in some ways, both an information vacuum and information overload at the same time. Oddly enough, we had at the start particularly a lack of clear information on what's going on, how bad is it, how long is it going to last, what is it caused by, is it in the air, is it in bodily fluids, is it whatever, how is it transmitted, all of this sort of stuff. So we had that complete lack of knowledge, even from experts who were still trying to unravel exactly what's going on in the early months. And that information vacuum then also enabled anyone who wanted to inject their own kind of views into this, and wonder cures, conspiracy theories explaining and so on. So that was very much a human-driven aspect of this that simply used the technologies available to do this. So that's really what I meant at that point. We have, and this is not a new observation, that question that in a crisis moment, people seek explanations, search for answers anywhere they can find them. And if there's no authoritative answers out there, then they're going to find them somewhere else, because it's a human tendency to want to explain things, basically, to want ideally an easy explanation, a reassuring explanation that says, okay, yeah, it was Bill Gates doing an experiment that went wrong, or it's 5G technology or whatever, rather than just, well, pandemics happen every 50 to 100 years, and we'll just have to get used to that. So people trying to find these easier answers, basically, these comforting answers, essentially. That's a human tendency. That's long been this way, and now we're using social media to do that. But before that, we would have used other available media forms or just word of mouth, and those still play a role as well. So that's what I mean. So that's absolutely what I mean at that point. And yes, of course, now in this environment, it is possible to, as they say, do your own research and find whatever answers you find comforting and convenient. And that's what that example of the poster there showed. That lady clearly did this, went around, found a bit of QAnon, found a bit of anti-Bill Gates and whatever conspiracy theories, and put that all together into a nice poster. That's a very human thing to do in many ways. It's really forming a worldview out of the information that she encountered, essentially. So if that's what I mean, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Just a very small follow-up question. The one thing that in this lecture today, in my opinion, maybe not got the full attention that it deserved was the level of actors that are, let's say, government and institutions, right? Because in our Ordo, maybe neoliberal projects, there is a certain sense of depoliticization of issues, where we see that on social media, call it fake news or whatever, there is a certain trend for politicization of these issues. Yeah. So in this disalignment, is this a sort of meta polarization, or how should we view this context?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'll say, maybe answer that by reflecting a bit on the work that we did also, particularly around the COVID crisis. Well, we did a close analysis of the COVID 5G conspiracy theory, for instance. So the idea that 5G technology somehow caused COVID or made COVID worse or whatever. And we traced those conspiracy theories through from their early origins all the way through widespread circulation. One of the things that we found, and this is, I think, speaks to your point on the different actors, is that at first they were very much within these small pre-existing anti-5G communities and anti-vax communities. And they really broke out once celebrities endorsed them, once celebrity media reported on the celebrity endorsements, and once then politicians and experts and more quality mainstream media found the need to report on that and respond to it. So that was very much, once the bigger and more influential actors with greater reach got involved, then it really took off and reached a much larger audience, basically. So that, I think you're absolutely right in that sense, if that's how I understood that part of the question as well. It's very important to consider the actors and not suggest that all actors are created equal, but that some certainly have a much bigger audience, much bigger influence, ultimately, on further developments than others. So that's something that needs to be taken into account there. And then when you say a kind of a meta polarization based on that,
I couldn't find any better term.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So what do you mean though by that then?
Well, that there is these, like, I think you just now mentioned them as like elite or quality sources of information that we see a trend in depoliticizing certain issues.
Right. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas
Sure. Yeah.
amongst the people on social media, there is a trend to politicize certain issues.
True. Yeah. So then you get also into things like both-siding and so on, where a news outlet might, for whatever reason, because of a misunderstood approach to objectivity, or because maybe for political or economic reasons, might just not condemn one side of a debate as being outlandish and conspiracy, but actually report both of them at an equal level, for instance, that sort of thing. So that, yes, absolutely, that comes into play then, of course, as well, that there is sometimes a strong unwillingness for political or economic reasons, or maybe just because of a fear of a backlash from the highly organized hyper-partisans, to speak out against misinformation, disinformation, to even call it that, to say, for instance, that Donald Trump lies, rather than just that he has outlandish views, that there's a distinction there. So so that often comes into play then as well. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you. On the referendum, you said that the no camp set the tone much earlier, was stronger and apparently more efficient than the yes camp. And this bears similarities with the 2005 Dutch referenda on the European Constitution here in Europe, and with Brexit. And my question is, do you think that the no camp's arguments, they resonate with the public? Because this is the main point of the populists. Yeah. And secondly, on a destructive polarization. Sorry, you explained very well, how you establish what destructive polarization is. Now, once you have established that, how do you deal with this?
Very good question. Yes, thank you. I'll start with the slightly easier question first, and that's the question of the no camp. I mean, one thing I would say generally for any kind of referendum that is simply a yes versus no question, the no camp starts with an advantage. Partly because, again, without wanting to engage in pop psychology, but people don't like change. It's always easier to argue for the status quo than for some change that might bring in unexpected changes beyond that people aren't fully on board with or don't quite understand. So keeping things as they are is always the easier choice than changing something with whatever might happen afterwards. So in any kind of referendum context, whether that's in the voice referendum in Australia, the EU constitutional referenda, any of these, it's always easier to say, no, let's just keep things as they are, they work fine. That's the fundamental of it. In fact, in Australia, I believe it's true, that's certainly been talked about a lot, that practically no referendum has ever won when the yes side wasn't supported in a bipartisan way by all sides of politics. So if there is division between a yes camp and a no camp, the referendum will fail. If both sides of politics agree, or all sides of politics agree, we should vote yes, it's a good idea, then the referendum will win, basically. That's simply been the fundamental case so far. It'd be interesting to see how that translates in other contexts, particularly in countries that do referenda very frequently. In Switzerland, for instance, we of course have a very different model. Maybe it bears out even there, although I would expect that because of the frequency of referenda, it might be slightly different there. But yes, the no camp starts with an advantage, quite simply. And in particularly in the context of something like the voice referendum, people didn't necessarily understand what a voice to parliament is or was, so it wasn't perhaps quite clearly enough articulated. I would absolutely make that criticism. And it's a fairly abstract concept as well that people need to understand. So any kind of yes campaign arguing for that kind of change needs to get organized and get started very early on to explain this is what that means, this is what it would do, this is what it wouldn't do, address obviously any kind of conspiracy theories and disinformation floating around about it as well. And that's a lot of hard work because it's a lot easier to take this sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt campaign essentially that can be run by just throwing out all sorts of things. And as a no side, you can do that quite effectively. Just throw out all sorts of conspiracy theories. Some of that will stick, and keep the yes side constantly having to defend against these kinds of things. I mean, literally during this campaign, there was a debate driven in part by Sky News about whether the Uluru Statement from the Heart that suggested the voice referendum had 1 page or 26 pages. That should not be a difficult question to answer. You look at the thing, it's got 1 page, but even that was queried and questioned throughout the referendum, so there was constantly that sense of uncertainty and lack of understanding and very deliberate kind of obfuscation and confusion that took place over the course of the referendum. So yeah, it's very easy if you're unscrupulous enough to sow a lot of doubt and confusion amongst voters if you are the no camp, and the yes camp constantly will have to respond to that in order to get its message heard. So I think that's just the fundamental of referenda, I think. It would be a different story if it wasn't a yes-no question, but do you want this option or do you want that option? Then both sides would be on a much more equal footing. But of course, referenda are also designed in this way because, particularly with constitutional changes, we don't want to make them easily. We want a strong support amongst the public for a change to our fundamental basic laws if we're making them. So in some sense, I understand why a no vote would always have a slight advantage built in essentially into the process. So that's on that, I think, and that I think that probably translates to other referenda quite well as well. Now, although I will also say how that, if we apply that same logic to something like the Brexit referendum in the UK, for instance, it should have been a lot easier to argue no than yes. And there I think the no side just didn't do a particularly good job in the first place, probably. And the yes side was clearly very motivated. So somehow in the Brexit referendum in the UK, the roles were sort of reversed in a weird kind of way. But that's a different story. Now, the more present question, yes, you're absolutely right. You've really put your finger on that question. If we identify, if we determine that there is destructive polarization in place in a particular context, what do we then do about that? How do we address these symptoms? And that's without wanting to take an easy way out here, I think it's often very context specific, obviously. What is this about? What are we destructively polarized about? Is this a matter of an asymmetrical level of polarization? So is it one side that is really highly destructive and the other side is not? Then we need to deal with that in a different way from two sides of politics both being destructively polarized against each other. So the voice referendum that I've talked about, I think I would argue that the no side is more destructively polarized than the yes side is. in many, again, just going to the obvious case, looking at the US, I think both sides of politics are probably by now destructively polarized against each other. So that needs another way of dealing with that. I think if you've got two sides that are more or less equally, maybe that goes too far, but that both show signs of destructive polarization, there's a lot of reconciliation and bridge building from both sides that needs to be done in some way, but also in a way that's safe and sensible, bringing people from both sides together to better understand each other again, to begin to communicate effectively again, to reduce the level of affective, emotional polarization between the two sides, to speak more about issues that they might both be able to agree on. Those would be measures perhaps that you could take if both sides are just very destructively polarized against each other. In the case of asymmetrical destructive polarization, is actually more about, in a sense, de-radicalizing one side of the debate and or perhaps separating those radical elements from the more mainstream elements of of that side as well. So in Australia, I mean, again, in the voice referendum, in the end, 60% of people voted no. That doesn't mean that 60% of Australians are utter racists and extremely far-right, destructively polarized. But it means that amongst that larger group of 60%, destructively polarizing views have taken a great deal of root as well. So it's actually about breaking apart that linkage, I guess, between that significant segment of the population and these extreme views and problematic views that were driven by a significant part of the no camp. So that's the linkage that needs to be decoupled so that you can have a more constructive level of political debate, again, even between yes and no supporters about appropriate ways for indigenous recognition and reconciliation. And then detaching the extreme elements of the debate from that. Now, how you do that, that's difficult, and it probably needs a de-radicalization expert more than someone like me, but that to me is sort of the question at that point.
Okay. I think our time here is up, but there is coffee waiting for us, and Professor Bruns will be happily answering any other question over a cup of coffee. So rest us to thank Professor Bruns once more. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
and see you all in the next edition. Have a nice afternoon.